This room, at least the hallway, has regularly spaced openings, wide openings, which may or may not have actually been doors, but at least were windows you could see out, and you can see the whole town.
Really?
Yeah, from these hallways you can look out and see all of the people's houses.
Huh.
They're just, the ruins or the foundations are just stretched out all around, so it definitely gives the impression that the synagogue is the center of this town.
At the center of virtually all religious faith systems, including mainstream Christendom, is the concept called the immortal soul. This is the idea that somehow there's an immaterial part of man, the real essence of man that lives on even after death. And this is such an ingrained belief in our culture. It's just a deeply ingrained assumption, the way we view the world. But when we look at the Hebraic view of the soul, the nephesh, we have to start out by going back to the creation text. And there we find how the soul came into being, the nephesh came into being. In Genesis 2:7 it says that he breathed into him the breath of life, and he became a living soul or a living being. The word that is used for breath that was breathed into man, the core concept is wind. And so it was the breathing in of this breath by which man became a living soul.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
As is so well reflected in Job 34:14 and 15 and other passages, if God removes the spirit, if he gathers the breath to himself, all flesh will perish, and man will return to the dust of the ground. Now, the thing about the soul or the nephesh that's also important to realize is that not only did the soul come into being by the inbreathing of the breath of life, and that when that breath is removed, that soul ceases to exist. As Ezekiel says, the soul that sins, it shall die. When God removes my spirit and I die, my life ceases. Not only does my body go into the ground, but my relationships, my work, my joys, all these things cease, and I am dead. There's also another important thing to understand. That's reflected especially in Romans chapter 2, where Paul makes it plain that immortality is something that is given. When you read this passage concerning the judgment, it says that those who seek to do what is right, to them is given immortality. You see, once we die and once we go into the grave, unless something happens to bring us back to life, that death is irreversible. So what must happen, and what is pictured in Romans 2 and other passages, is that we are resurrected. In Romans 2, he makes it plain that the righteous will be given immortality. It's not something that is essential to man. It's not something that is part of our natural essence. Immortality is something that we must gain at the judgment seat of Christ because of a faithful and righteous life. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51, Paul begins his discussion of immortality by saying, "We shall not all sleep." It's important to understand that the "we" is clearly here a reference to the faithful. And when he uses the word sleep, this is a wonderful comfort to the faithful, because it means that this death in the grave will be much like a moment. Because when you think about sleeping, when you sleep through a night, you don't realize that you've slept for 8 hours. You wake up in the morning anew, and it's almost as though the last thing you remember is when you went to sleep the night before. Paul says that this mortal must put on immortality. Immortality is not something that is inherent to our being. It's something that we must put on. Mainstream Christianity teaches that the reward of the righteous is to spend eternity in heaven.
Jerusalem is seen as it's important, but it's important because it just represents that God fulfills his word to Israel. But as far as personally, Jerusalem has no real importance. And the land has no real importance because we're a heavenly people, according to the way we believe then. Whereas now I understand that Paul in Galatians 3:26 says that because of our covenant relationship with Messiah, that the Abrahamic covenant is central to my hope.
There are two things that are critical to understand here. First of all, we must understand the Abrahamic covenant is central in the message of the gospel of the kingdom of God. In Genesis chapters 12, 13, 15, 17, and 22, God gives in increasing detail the promise that he makes to Abraham and his descendants. The three central aspects of the Abrahamic covenant involve, first, the blessing. It says, in your descendants or in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we know from Galatians that descendant that he speaks of there, your seed, ultimately refers to Jesus, the Messiah, and anticipates his coming. Secondly is the promise of a multitude of descendants. He was promised that he would be a father of many nations. And as we also learn from the New Testament writings, this was ultimately fulfilled by the bringing in of Gentiles to be part of the seed of Abraham. And then third is the promise of the land. The land going from the river Euphrates all the way over to the great river Egypt. The second thing that's critical is to avoid the disconnect when looking at passages like Galatians 3:29. Because when we read the promises, even if we read through the book of Genesis and we encounter chapter 12 and chapter 13 and chapter 15 where it speaks of the promises of the Abrahamic covenant, we always think of it as something that's back there and something that is promised to them. But if you look at this passage, it says that those who are Christ's are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. And you can't say it any more clearly than that.
Central to the Abrahamic covenant is the promise of the land. The land is, whether you speak from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation, the land is the center. This Eretz Yisrael is the center of all the hopes of those who believe and place their trust in God's promises in that covenant. And Jerusalem is at the very center because Jerusalem is the capital, the place where David's throne and thus the throne of the son of David will sit, and he will rule from there. And that means something to me because I will return here. And if God wills and by his mercy, I will have an inheritance in this wonderful place and with Israel, because as Paul teaches in Romans, I have been grafted into that hope of the good olive tree, which is fitting, I guess, here with the olive trees.